Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're doing things a little differently. Well, not really differently, but we're going to Detroit.
Buckle up.
Yeah. But not for the reasons you think. We're not talking about cars.
Yeah.
This is about social engineering projects back in the 20th century and how those projects impacted specifically the Polish community in Detroit.
And the rise of black activism.
Yeah, and so this is really interesting because...
It's really interesting because...
Go ahead.
It really throws a wrench into a lot of the simplistic narratives about this era.
Yeah.
We like to think that, progress just happened. But, when you look at how these changes played out on the ground in real neighborhoods for real families,
Yeah.
We're going beyond just saying progress happened.
Right. And the families that were impacted, like you said, and the changes that we're going to be talking about. To do that, we're going very deep on a Barsoom article, White Ethnic Cleansing as Social Control.
Oh, yeah.
Published very recently on September 29th. So this is hot off the press. When I saw that title, I was like, ooh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know about this.
It's a loaded phrase.
Very loaded.
Yeah. But I think as we get into this, you'll see that it's less about pointing fingers. It's more about just examining the familiar story from a fresh perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and providing, like you said, a nuanced view of what happened. So to set the stage here, it's the early 1900s. Detroit is just booming. Why? Because of the auto industry. People are coming from all over the world, but specifically the article focuses on Polish immigrants. And not just like individual immigrants coming, but whole communities. They're picking up and moving.
Yeah, they're like, this is where we're going. They understood their strength in numbers.
Right.
They had shared language, shared traditions, shared faith. All of this fostered a deep sense of unity.
Right.
And as the article points out, this translated into significant leverage.
Totally.
When it came to things like labor organizing, even wielding political influence.
Right, because there's power in numbers. And what happens when a workforce is unified?
Oh, yeah.
It's not good if you're the person at the top. You don't want a unified workforce. That means they can demand things.
Exactly. You can't manipulate them. You can't pit them against each other. It's all about control. Right?
Yeah. So they had to figure out a way to disrupt this unity.
Right.
And so the way that was done, that the article argues, is divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Which we even see today.
Oh, absolutely. This is a tale as old as time.
Yeah.
But, in this specific case, the article highlights how during World War II, industrialists like Henry Ford actively encouraged the migration of Black Americans from the South to work in the factories.
Right.
And it's not to say that there weren't Black Americans already in Detroit, but you had this new labor pool. They were desperate for work. They were less integrated into existing unions or social structures.
Right.
And so it's a win-win for the factory owners.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever experienced this when you were a kid, but if you have kids, maybe you've done this. My parents used to do this to me all the time, where to distract me, they'd give me like a toy or something, like, go play with this.
Right.
But it's really just so they can do the thing that you don't want them to do.
Yeah.
So it's like they're being distracted, they're being given this thing, which on its face is a good thing. Like, come to Detroit, there are jobs here.
Right.
But it's really just to weaken the existing power.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
That's a really good analogy. And, this kind of deliberate influx of workers, while, again, could be seen as a win for the factory owners, it also brought about, significant social challenges, right? The article even draws parallels to, debates we have today surrounding immigration, integration. What happens when you have these rapid demographic shifts? You have this tension between opportunity and upheaval.
Right, and this is where things in Detroit start to heat up. This is where the article brings us to 1942 and the construction of the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. So this is a federally funded project, low-income housing. But here's the thing. It was intended for Black residents, and it was built right next to a Polish neighborhood.
Right.
That already existed.
Right next door.
And so their article really seems to indicate that this was by design.
Oh, yeah. The placement of this project, despite strong objections from the Polish community, was no accident, right?
Yeah.
It was a very calculated move to kind of break up these existing ethnic enclaves.
Yeah.
Using urban renewal as a sort of Trojan horse.
Right. Because we always hear about urban renewal as like this positive thing, right? Like we're going to revitalize a blighted area. But what the article seems to suggest is that was just a guise.
It's just a nice way of saying, we're reshaping the city even if it means disrupting existing communities.
Yeah.
And, it's crucial to remember that for many communities like this, a neighborhood wasn't just about where you lived.
Right.
It was about shared heritage, support systems, even a sense of safety and identity in what was often a very new and unfamiliar city for these folks.
Totally. And so you can see how there was already this tension that was beginning to brew.
Yeah, and with everything we just talked about, all those anxieties, they didn't just magically disappear.
Right.
It was only a matter of time before this clash between the government's vision for the city and then the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
It was going to reach a boiling point.
Yeah. So we left off with this, like I said, this tension brewing, and specifically with this Sojourner Truth housing project,
Right.
which kind of embodies all of these anxieties
Yeah.
and this resentment and fear of what's to come.
Right.
And so the Polish community knows what's going on. They understand.
They see it.
The writing's on the wall.
Absolutely.
And they try to push back on this.
Yeah.
And they try to say, like, hey, this isn't right.
Yeah, the article talks about how Reverend Jenku, who was a prominent figure in the Polish community,
Okay.
became a really vocal critic of this
Of the project.
of the project, yeah. And it's not that he didn't understand like the need for better housing, but he was saying, look, displacing residents, disrupting the social fabric of this neighborhood,
Right.
this isn't a solution.
Right.
And he even pleaded with city planners. He's like, look, you got to reconsider the location of this. Like, think about the consequences.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Yes.
Like you're trying to do a good thing.
Right. But are you, though?
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't listen, obviously.
No,
what happens?
Well, I mean, instead of engaging in dialogue
Right.
or, considering other solutions,
Right.
they responded with a show of force.
Okay.
They sent in, get this, state troopers, the National Guard,
Wow.
to enforce the integration of the housing project.
Hold on. The National Guard.
The National Guard.
Like, we're at war right now, World War II.
I know, it's crazy.
And they're not fighting, the Axis powers. They're being sent to integrate a housing project in Detroit.
I know, it's wild. But it just shows how determined they were to see this through, right?
Right.
And remember, this is post-World War II America.
Right.
The nation is grappling with its image, right?
Yeah.
On the world stage.
Right.
They're so desperate to distance themselves from, Nazi Germany.
Right.
The horrors of racial intolerance, right?
Right.
And so this need to embody the opposite, right?
Yeah.
To be a beacon of racial equality and progress.
Right.
It fueled a lot of these, aggressive social engineering agendas.
Yeah, it's almost like they felt this pressure, like they had something to prove, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, we're not like that, we learn from the mistakes.
Yeah.
But did we really learn from the mistakes, or are we just like repeating them in a different way?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, what's the line between promoting equality and just like forcing it,
Imposing it.
imposing it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the consequences are.
And this kind of gets to what you were talking about
How
earlier
is that?
about this controlling the narrative.
Oh, yeah.
Which is something that the article really emphasizes. And I think that's what's so interesting about it.
Oh, totally.
Because it brings up this point about the Detroit race riot in 1943, so just a year later,
Right.
and how that was really, the narrative around that was really controlled.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for our listeners who aren't familiar
Yeah.
with the 43 riot, what is the article's take on that?
Well, it challenges the traditional narrative, that's for sure.
Okay.
We're told that this riot was the result of, white racism.
Right.
But the reality, or at least according to this article, is much more nuanced.
Okay.
It claims that the violence was actually instigated by black residents.
Interesting.
Now, this isn't to justify or downplay racism at the time,
Right.
but it's just saying, like, let's acknowledge that these events were complex.
Right.
There were multiple factors at play.
Totally. Because even today, right,
My God.
we see this with any
All that time.
sort of like social unrest that happens. It's
Yeah.
always like, who can control the narrative first?
Yes.
And then that's what everyone believes happened.
Exactly.
But it's never that simple.
Never, ever, ever. And what's so interesting is that the article connects this riot, this eruption of violence, back to the Sojourner Truth Project,
Okay.
like directly.
Interesting.
It suggests that the resentment, anxieties that were already simmering because of this whole thing.
Right, which we talked about.
Yeah. It created this tinderbox And then the riot was the match.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. So this wasn't just some random act of violence.
Yeah.
This was a symptom of these larger,
But the social, the political
climate.
the climate, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And to add on to that, you're saying that this riot, these origins of this riot were covered up.
It seems that way, according to the article.
Wow.
It wasn't just like historical revisionism.
Right.
It had real world consequences.
Right.
Because it solidified this narrative that, oh, white resistance is the problem.
Right.
That's what's preventing racial progress.
Right. And so anyone who is now afraid of this rapid integration
Right.
can't speak
They
up
can't say anything.
because then they're just racist.
Exactly.
Right.
They're part of the problem.
It's like you're not allowed to have a nuanced view of this situation.
Exactly. And that's what's so frustrating, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you were someone who, let's say, supported the idea of integration,
Right.
but you had issues with how it was being implemented.
Right. The speed at which it was happening.
The speed, you see the tension, the displacement,
Well,
you can't say anything.
Because then you're just instantly labeled.
You're labeled.
And you're the problem.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow. And this all coincides.
And this is the crazy part.
Right.
This climate of fear and silencing,
Yeah.
it happens at the same time as these landmark Supreme Court cases that give the government even more power to reshape cities.
Right. To reshape
To
society.
reshape society. Yep.
It's like we're talking about this time when the rules are being rewritten.
Yeah.
And not everyone knows the rules.
Right.
And not everyone knows that the rules are even being rewritten, you know?
Right, right. It's like we're changing the game as we go.
Exactly.
And some people are just like trying to figure out how to play.
Right. And then they get penalized for it, even though they didn't even know they were breaking the rules. It's crazy.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's those everyday people, the families trying to make sense of it all.
Right.
Those are the stories that the article really like brings to life, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, these big rulings, they sound great on paper,
Right.
but what about the human cost?
Totally.
What are the people who are like caught in the middle of all this?
Yeah. So let's get into some of these court cases because
Yeah.
you said there were 3, right?
3 big ones, yeah.
That had major repercussions, not just for Detroit,
Right, but for cities all over
the nation.
the whole country.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so first up, you've got Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. Now, this one outlawed those racially restrictive covenants we talked about earlier.
Okay. So those covenants, remind me again what those are.
So basically, they were these agreements
Okay.
baked right into housing deeds
Okay.
that basically said, like, you can't sell this property to certain groups of people.
Okay. So it's basically a tool for segregation. Okay. So getting rid of them makes sense.
Right. And the article even acknowledges that, like, on the surface, it seems like a win for equality.
Right.
But then it's like, okay, but what happens when you remove these covenants?
Right.
What are the unintended consequences?
Yeah, because you've got these communities who are just trying to like create stability
Except
for their
yeah,
families.
And some identity, too, right?
Right, because think about it. They escaped like persecution in many cases.
Exactly.
They built new lives.
They built their own little worlds.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And these covenants, as flawed as they were, they offered a sense of control in this like rapidly changing world.
Right.
And suddenly that's gone.
It's like we're doing this for you, but it's like, did you ask us?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Like, we know what's best for you.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about housing, right? It was happening at the same time as this Brownie Board of Education,
Oh, yeah, that was huge.
which was school desegregation.
Facets.
So now you're talking about families
Yeah.
who are like, okay, my neighborhood is changing. Now they're like, wait a minute, my kid's going to school across town.
Exactly. Exactly. You've got busing programs. You've got all this upheaval.
And just like, what's going on?
And again, Brown v. Board was monumental.
It was.
There was a huge step in the right direction, but the article argues that the way it was implemented,
Right.
it just added fuel to the fire.
Right, because it's one thing to say separate but equal is not right, right?
Right.
We all agree with that. But it's another thing to be like, okay, now your kids are going to go to school across town.
Right, right. It's like, where's the plan?
Yeah.
Where's the thought about how this is actually going to work for people?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's when we really see this white flight
Oh, yeah.
start to happen.
The exodus begins.
Everyone's going to the suburbs.
Yep. They're looking for stability. They're looking for a sense of control.
They're looking for familiarity.
Familiarity. It's
Something that feels safe.
Absolutely. It's tragic,
It is because you've got these efforts, right?
Yeah.
That are like, on their face, meant to bring people together.
Right.
But they end up pushing people further apart. It's like, how did we get here?
It's like the opposite of what they were trying to do. Exactly. And it just goes to show, like, these top-down policies, they often clash with the realities on the ground.
They always do. Totally. And there was one more case.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we can't forget about Berman v. Parker in 54.
Okay.
Now, this one was all about eminent domain.
Eminent domain, what's that? Refresh my memory.
So basically, it's the government's power to seize private property for public use.
Okay.
Even if the property owner doesn't want to sell.
So you're telling me the government can just take your house?
Well, not exactly your house, but they could take your property.
Yeah.
If they deemed it necessary for, like a new development, a highway, that kind of thing.
But it's your property.
It is. But the idea is that the public good trumps individual property rights.
But still, that doesn't seem fair. You're just like working hard, you buy your house, you start a business, and then the government's like, nope, we need this.
Right. And the article argues that this ruling, Berman v. Parker, it basically gave the government a blank check to reshape cities.
In their vision.
Exactly. And, the justification was always the same, right?
What's that?
The greater good.
Right.
Progress,
A more modern city, a more equitable city.
More integrated, more equitable, all of those things. But the reality is...
Yeah, it didn't really work out that way.
Rarely does, right?
Yeah.
You tear down these physical structures, but what about the communities?
The livelihoods.
The livelihoods, the sense of place, all of that gets bulldozed too.
Totally.
And nobody's talking about that.
And no one asks those communities, what do you guys think?
Exactly.
Do that yacht.
Just like, we know what's best for you.
Yeah, yeah. And the article says this wasn't just the government doing this, right?
Right. There are other players.
Yeah.
Big NGOs like the Ford Foundation, they poured money into this.
Interesting. Okay.
Promoting rapid integration, social change.
So wasn't that their goal?
On paper, yes.
Right.
But the article suggests that there was this, paternalistic attitude.
Oh, here we go again, that we know better than you.
Exactly. It's like, we have the money, we have the power.
You know what's best for you.
We're going to fix you.
Right. And what happens if you speak out against that?
You're labeled, you're silenced, you're on the wrong side of history.
Wow, so it's like this perfect storm of factors that are contributing to what's happening in Detroit. And the people who it's supposed to be helping are the ones who are suffering the most.
Exactly. Exactly.
Like they were, like you said, they were blamed. Those communities, those white ethnic communities.
The scapegoat, right?
They became the scapegoat for the city's decline.
They're clinging to the past. They're resisting progress.
It's easier to blame someone than to admit you were wrong.
Way easier.
Yeah.
And that's what's so frustrating, right?
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, if the government, with all its power and resources and influence in these big organizations, if they couldn't get it right, what hope is there for anyone else?
It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And I think this is a story about Detroit.
Yeah.
But this is really a story about so much more.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a story about the hubris of social engineering.
Totally.
It's a story about the importance of listening to those who are impacted by these decisions.
Yes.
The people on the ground. And it's a story about what happens when we silence dissent in the name of progress.
Because progress at what cost, right?
Exactly.
That's the question we need to be asking ourselves.
Always, always be asking that question.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think so too.
This has been another deep dive.
A deep run.
A very deep dive into a really complex and nuanced issue. And I think, for everyone listening, just take a moment, reflect on what we talked about, because like you said, history is repeating itself.
All the time.
Over and over again.
Over and over.
So until next time, keep asking questions, keep seeking out those diverse perspectives, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you.